A historic bipartisan bill passed the House of Representatives last week. Audit the Fed is a bill that would demand transparency from the Federal Reserve. But is it necessary? Ben has the reality check you won't see anywhere else.
As Congress passed historic legislation, H.R. 459, also known as Audit the Fed, a co-worker asked me this question: how would any of this affect my life? And it's a good question. To understand how the Federal Reserve affects you, first you have to understand what the Federal Reserve is. The Federal Reserve Bank was started in 1913 by an act of Congress, but not really. You see, Congress allowed the creation of the Fed, but the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 wasn't drafted by Congress. It was drafted under great secrecy in a meeting of associates of very powerful men at a place called Jekyll Island. I know, sounds like a movie, right? The men represented at that meeting, J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, and the Rothschild banking family. The wealth of the five families represented at that meeting represented at the time 1/4 of all the wealth in the world. If you have not read the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, you should. It explains in great detail how the Federal Reserve Bank came into existence, and it's a very strange story. Now, I could spend an hour explaining all the details on the history of the Fed, but time won't allow it. So in short, it's critical to understand the objectives of the Federal Reserve. The Fed was drafted with 5 objectives. Number 1, to stop competition from newer banks, especially banks in the western part of the United States. 2, to obtain a franchise to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending. 3, to get control of all the reserves of other banks so that reckless banks wouldn't be overrun. 4, to shift the losses from the banks to the taxpayers. And 5, to convince Congress that the purpose was to protect the public. So here's how it works. If the government needs money, the U.S. Treasury prints it, but the Treasury needs to get it out to the public. And that's where the Fed comes in. The Federal Reserve Bank will take that newly printed money, which was created out of nothing, then gives it to other banks. The banks then loan the money to you and me, and we pay interest. And the interest we pay then goes back to the Treasury and to the banks who loan the money in the first place. So what's the problem here? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank is not responsible to anyone, not to Congress, not to the President, and most importantly, not to the American people. In 2011, the Government Accountability Office conducted a first-of-its-kind audit of some of the lending practices of the Fed after the 2008 financial crisis. According to Democrat Congressman Bernie Sanders of Vermont, as a result of this audit, we now know that the Federal Reserve provided more than $16 trillion in total financial assistance to some of the largest financial institutions and corporations in the United States and throughout the world. Among the investigation's key findings is that the Fed unilaterally provided trillions of dollars in financial assistance to foreign banks and corporations from South Korea to Scotland. Again, according to that GAO report. Now, the investigation also found that there is no process in which the Fed prevents conflicts of interest. For instance, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase served on the New York Fed's board of directors at the same time that his bank received more than $390 billion in financial assistance from the Fed. Moreover, J.P. Morgan Chase served as one of the clearing banks for the Fed's emergency lending programs. And there's more. Take September 19, 2008, William Dudley, who was now the New York Fed president, he was granted a waiver to let him keep investments in AIG and General Electric at the same time that AIG and GE were given bailout funds. Now, one reason the Fed did not make Dudley sell his holdings, according to the audit, was that it might have created the appearance of a conflict of interest. So what you need to know is that this Audit the Fed bill is one of the few bipartisan efforts to pass the House of Representatives in years. 89 Democrats signed on with Republicans to support the bill. But as we've told you, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid claims that he will not allow the bill to get an up or down vote in the Senate, despite the fact that he himself spent 25 years calling for an audit of the Fed. The biggest question, why? Does auditing the Federal Reserve mean that the Fed will change any of its behaviors? Well, if not, then why not audit them? If so, then all the more reason to shine light on what the Federal Reserve is really doing. And that is Reality Check.
If you would like to make your voice heard on this story, you can head over to Ben's Facebook page. You can find it